Welcome to the Hope and Focus podcast, where hope has a voice. We highlight the journeys of those impacted by Leber congenital amaurosis and other inherited retinal diseases, and the work driving change. Thanks for being here.
Welcome, everyone, to the Hope and Focus podcast. I'm your host, Ben Shaberman, with the Foundation Fighting Blindness, and I'm also an advisor to Hope and Focus. And for this episode, we'll be talking all about patient advocacy with Kara Fick from Atsena Therapeutics and Andy Bolan from Sepul Bio. Andy and Kara are great people, and they're great patient advocates with companies which excitingly have therapies for LCA in clinical trials. Atsena has a gene therapy for LCA1 moving into a phase 3 trial, and Sepul Bio has an RNA therapy for LCA10 called sepofarsen moving into a phase 3 trial. And while we're no doubt excited about their emerging therapies, for this episode, we're going to focus on how Andy and Kara help patients and families understand the clinical trial journey and how, in turn, patients help them understand their personal journeys. Because, importantly, patient input is critical to developing therapies and designing clinical trials. So first, I'd like to welcome Kara to the podcast. Kara, it's great to have you here.
I am so excited and honored to join today. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our honor and privilege. And a little background on Kara. She is the director of patient advocacy at Atsena, as I already mentioned. And there she works to integrate the real life experiences of patients and families affected by inherited retinal diseases into the gene therapy development process. She spent over a decade working in patient advocacy across various rare disease communities and is a passionate believer in the power of the patient voice. Kara joined Atsena more than 3 years ago, and on her very first day happened to meet Hope and Focus founder Laura Manfrey while sitting next to each other at lunch during a conference. And Kara, I feel like I was at that meeting. I feel like I met you like on your first or second day. What meeting was that?
It was one of the Foundation Fighting Blindness Visions conferences.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I did meet you back then too. It was kind of meant to be.
It really was. Well, 3 years later, it's exciting to have you here. You've really become an important member of this community. So thanks
Thank you,
again.
Ben.
So next, I'd like to welcome Andy. Andy, I've known you for a number of years, and it's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite. It's fantastic to take part in something like this and discuss the really fascinating research and things that happen behind the curtain as well with you all.
Well, thanks again, Andy. I don't remember the very moment I met you first, but a little background on Andy. He's the current patient advocacy director for Sepul Bio, which is an innovative business unit of Laboratoire Thea. And that's my French, as challenging as it may be. Anyway, Andy is an experienced advocacy and corporate affairs professional, and he specializes in championing the community voice within companies, clinical teams, and leadership forums. He started his career in London in 2012, working in various corporate affairs roles. Then he moved into patient advocacy roles at Teva, Biogen, and Procure. So to start off, I want to get a sense how each of you ended up in patient advocacy. Because when you're growing up and even in school, I don't think you're thinking, wow, I want to be a patient advocate. So I'd like for you to talk about your journeys, however soon in your journeys you want to begin, on how you ended up at patient advocacy role. So, Kara, will you start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And Ben, you're absolutely right. I don't think I've ever met someone who is a patient advocate that said, "Yeah, I always knew I wanted to be a patient advocate when I grew up." I certainly ended up here kind of by accident. I'm very glad I did, but it was, just a series of accidents. When I was younger, I wanted to be a fashion designer, and then I wanted to be a chemist. I had no idea, but I started working for just a local drug pharmaceutical company, just filing papers, trying to get my foot in the door. And one day I happened to notice that there was some research. Sorry, there was a 5K taking place in our city for the disease that we were doing research for. And I said, "Hey guys, we should go to this 5K and go support it." It turns out nobody at the company had ever met someone who had the disease that we were working on. And so that was the first exposure for me to connecting drug research with the people who are actually affected by it, as well as the first experience for everyone at the company I was working for at the time. And since then, it's just been something that I've sort of fallen into and love and can't imagine doing anything else now.
Well, again, it's exciting to have you in our space because you're such a great patient advocate. What inspired you to go to Atsena? Because I don't think you were in ophthalmology previously. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I've always worked in rare genetic diseases, but I had never worked in ophthalmology before. So when I came across Atsena, very small company, and what I could tell from my first exposure was just that the people at the core of Atsena, the founders, the CEO, everybody who was the leadership was actually truly passionate about people, not just business. And sometimes that can be hard to find. And so I think I was just really, really drawn towards the people, the commitment, the passion, and then got exposed to the IRD community. And it was kind of an instant love. I mean, it's an incredible space to be working in. And I'm really, really happy and fortunate that I've ended up here.
I would agree you're fortunate. Atsena was founded by Shannon Boy, who is not only an outstanding researcher, but just a wonderful person. And her heart and spirit are definitely in the right place.
Mhm.
So, Andy, what did you want to be when you grew up? And if you say fashion designer, I will be very surprised. But hey,
Not quite, not down the fashion route. I don't really. I can barely dress myself in the morning. In fact, I'm looking forward to my daughter dressing me when she gets a little bit older. But no, interestingly, when I thought about this, I grew up in the countryside of England, so I wanted to be a professional cricketer growing up, or go into politics. And kind of when I wrote that down, preparing for the question, it's a very 18th century English answer, actually, politician and cricketer. So put that to one side. No, I mean, I didn't know much about advocacy in the round, but when I was kind of reflecting on it, probably one of the oldest professions that's ever been, as long as kind of democracy and politics has been around. People have always advocated for their positions. So I'm super fortunate and really love the fact that I've kind of found that within an industry that is really doing quite innovative and exciting research. And so I think back to when I started in London, I worked for the trade body for the pharmaceutical industry, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. And a lot of the discussions at the trade body are with government, wider stakeholders, and one of those groups being patient advocacy organizations, being in healthcare and being in that ecosystem. And I really found it fascinating how powerful that voice was. It was really, it took me by surprise just how, if you put on an event with a really good advocacy speaker, the politicians would turn up and they would listen, and they would listen with real intent to do action. And coming from industry, if you didn't have a good speaker on the roster, they didn't turn up. So I really kind of noticed the power of that. And, from my perspective, it then found a career working with those community advocates from an industry side and trying to bring that perspective into what companies do. And when it comes to clinical trials, we know it's now a really strong regulatory ask to have that lived experience in what you do when you create a protocol. So, being that bridge, it has been really, really fulfilling actually throughout my career. And I think, these kind of podcasts, I hope we can inspire some children to be, I want to be a patient advocacy director at some point. I doubt that will happen, but one step at a time.
I have faith in the next generation.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a great role because you're serving as a bridge between the patient and the therapy development world. And it's so important. And on that note, Andy, what do you do on a daily basis? And I know when we first met, you were with Procure, which was a different company. They had the two assets, sepofarsen for LCA10 and ultevursen for USH2A. And those ultimately made it over to Thea. Thea formed Sepul Bio. So what have you done in those roles with Procure and Sepul Bio? And has your daily role changed at all, would you say?
Yeah, no. So I'm quite fortunate in the advocacy roles that I've taken. I've worked in multiple different organizations in the pharma industry, as well as them being really big, medium, and with Procure a kind of biotech size. And the main difference is really the hands-on element with the community, I would say. And in rare disease particularly, which is what we're talking about, you really can't do the research without that community voice or perspective in it. In big companies, like I worked at Teva, in big disease areas, it's more about tweaking and actually listening to that lived experience. Is there a way of making someone's life much easier? The kind of pathway to treatment, or even, how to refill their prescriptions, all the way to telemedicine. So there's kind of really big, succinct differences between the size of companies and how you do your advocacy. For instance, at Teva, we were a company that served 200 million people a day. That's a huge country if you put it in the context. And maybe tweaking the way that we refill stuff and help people get access to medicines could have a really big impact to a large proportion of people. While here at Sepul Bio, we need 32 individuals for our Hyperion LCA trial. So those are the two real differences when it comes to hands-on. When it comes to daily activities, my sole responsibility is to be that voice of the community internally. So be that one-to-one discussions with our clinical scientists or our biostatisticians who will ask me, do we think this assessment is too burdensome? From a regulatory perspective, do we think that this is going to change someone's quality of life? And how do we find a metric to do so? And those kind of conversations, you need to be having pretty much daily conversations with experts like yourself, Ben, the foundation, or families themselves who are affected by the disease. And one of the really great pieces of work we've done with Hope and Focus is do a workshop where we could talk with CEP290 parents and individuals to ask them what would be a big difference, or even as minutiae as, if you have a 6-year-old, how do you keep them concentrating for 8 hours of assessments? From a clinical science perspective, you sit them in a chair and you shine a light. Well, actually, no. In reality, it's very, very different. So having that voice, and that workshop, I recorded it and have spread it very, very widely in Thea, just to give people an educational tool as well to some of the challenges that we face. So that's the kind of daily business. My responsibility is trying to amplify that. You've talked about the bridge. I really like that as an analogy, because companies find it very hard to get that perspective. And Kara mentioned about, it was the first time that they'd heard someone with the condition that they're helping. That's not a rarity. That happens quite a lot in industry. And, for us, we'll be having our first LCA10 speaker in January for Thea. And it will be the first time a community person has spoken at the headquarters ever. So it's a really big deal.
That's great. And I think it's important that people understand in the rare disease space, it's a whole different situation than for a common disease. Like you said, when you were with Teva, you had millions and millions of people who were taking their medications and so on. In the rare disease space, there's so few people who understand or appreciate where people are coming from with their rare conditions. So I think that makes your role that much more important. Not that it wasn't important in those other companies. So Kara, I know you wear a lot of hats at Atsena, not just patient advocacy, but tell us what your day-to-day life is like.
So I would say every single day is very different for me. Andy was kind of mentioning that much of what he does is involved with various different departments at his company, and I think that that's the case almost always with patient advocacy. Is it's not this isolated, you know, repetitive day-to-day job that, you clock in and out at 8 and 5 and call it a day. So my focus at Atsena is patient advocacy, and like Andy, maybe some days I we've actually also hosted a workshop with the LCA community to give us feedback on our program, which was incredibly valuable. I hope that every company does that for every development program that they initiate. It's so valuable. So maybe one day will be spent doing that. Another day might be spent on the phone or exchanging emails with a parent whose child has just been diagnosed with LCA and they're looking for any available opportunity that might make a difference for their child and telling them about what does gene therapy mean or what is a clinical trial. Other days I'm meeting with maybe our team that's designing very complex protocols and have these long, long lists of different assessments that someone who participates in a clinical trial must do. And I sit in the room and say, okay, let's think about how we can actually make this feasible for someone who has to travel across the country and maybe needs to bring a caregiver with them and, is just going to need different types of accommodations than anybody is thinking about right now in this room. So every day is a little bit different. In addition to patient advocacy, I also cover our corporate communication. So when we make public announcements about what's going on with our program, I'm very involved in that. We'll put out press releases that are usually intended for more of like an investor community, but I like to write similar announcements for the patient community that say the same thing, but are messaged directly to patients and parents and family members. And then the other part of my role, of my many different hats, I've got a whole closet full of hats that I can switch in and out of throughout the day. Um, but my other role is called medical affairs. And so that deals with our company interacting with healthcare providers and doctors that are taking care of patients and helping them to understand the research that's taking place or their perspectives on caring for patients. So, in a nutshell, I would say that a lot of what I do is just connecting with people outside of our company, outside of the research space, and making sure everybody kind of has a seat at the table equally so that we can do our research better, faster, and more effectively.
That's a lot. That's a lot for sure. And I know this from personal experience, but explaining what a clinical trial is and what gene therapies are, it's easy to do in a nutshell to just say, well, a clinical trial is a human study, but to really help people appreciate what a clinical trial is, that is not a trivial thing to do. So I applaud you for helping people really understand the commitment and the risk and all that stuff. And the same applies to gene therapy. You can make gene therapy sound so simple, but it's also complicated, and it's really great that you help the lay community, patients and families understand those concepts.
There's a lot of great work that Hope and Focus does, that Foundation Fighting Blindness does, that other organizations do to try to help make that information easier to understand. So it's certainly not only my battle that I'm fighting uphill, but a group effort.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think, and I know this holds true for me, people need to hear it a few times before it really sinks in. That's how I learn. So if they hear from you, then maybe they hear from me or somebody else. Maybe they can absorb and process that information better. I'm curious, Kara, is there a particular moment or two that stands out for when you had an encounter or an interaction with a family that really stands out, that's memorable?
Yes, I have a few, but there's one in particular. I think when you're working in rare disease, it's a limited number of people who have this condition. And over the years, you start to see the same people over and over. You get to know people very well over time. That's something that's so special about a rare disease community is you enter a rare disease and kind of gain a family in a strange way. And so there was a rare disease community I was working with that I over the years would go to events, go to patient conferences, go to family fundraisers, and started to see the same people over and over. And I had one woman tell me, I've paid attention to research for a long time and I've interacted with a lot of different drug companies, and I've always felt like I'm just a number in their eyes. I'm just a research rat in their eyes. But because I've met you and you've come out so many times over and over again and you remember things about me, I actually feel like I'm a person to you and your company and not just a number. And that was really impactful for me and kind of, put a mark on the philosophy that I try to hold with patient advocacy and bring to companies. Many of the employees at a company you work for, again, are likely never to meet someone with the condition that they're working on. Maybe it's someone who works in the lab in a petri dish all day, or maybe it's someone who's doing Excel spreadsheets for the company budget or whatever it might be. They don't often get a lot of that face-to-face time, and it's so important to know that there are people behind the work that we do and to make sure that's not forgotten.
That's a great story. And I think what you're saying is so important. People on their journeys, whether it's a family member or patient, they may get bounced around quite a bit until they end up connected to you. And for you to spend the time to educate them and perhaps as important, listen. I think that's a really important part of the advocacy role. So thanks again for sharing that. Andy, how about you? Is there a moment or a particular encounter that stands out for you?
Yeah, I would say, well, just picking up on that point, one of the things that I present a lot internally is a picture of people, kind of two children with the kind of string phones, and it really the title of that slide is "Listening to Understand, Not to React," and there's a real reason for that, and it kind of reiterates a fantastic piece that Kara just said, that actually from an industry perspective, actually listening to what people are saying to you with the conditions that you're trying to alleviate is incredibly important in making sure that they feel that they're part of what we're doing and that you're actually doing good research and good science. So it's just something I picked up on it. It's a really, really succinct point that I think as all advocates in companies, we really try to drive that home, because Kara's right. Some of my colleagues will never come across an individual who will hopefully benefit from the work that they're doing. And it's our job to try and bridge that and bring them into to have those interactions, or, at least be able to see or hear from the families, be it through a workshop or another interaction. I think I was trying to reflect on this. I think the biggest kind of impact I had with family was after the trials were wound down at ProQR. So we knew that sepofarsen worked in some individuals. We had the clinical evidence for that. We had the anecdotal evidence for that. But the company just couldn't afford to carry on the clinical program. So the message went out that we were winding them down, and multiple families who were in the trial got in touch really to outline that. It gave me a huge motivation talking to them. Some families who really couldn't understand how the medicine was doing what it was doing to their children. And it was really quite powerful anecdotal discussion that it really drove me to go to our leadership at ProQR to almost vehemently outline that we need to continue a compassionate use program. Regardless of how long it would take, we should keep these people and individuals and children on the drug as long as we could, knowing that we were trying to move the assets on, which we eventually did, to Laboratoire Théa. But it was really the passion and the anecdotal conversations with those families, the Seps United families, that really drove me to argue internally with the leadership to put their money where their mouth is. And $1 million for a company that is stopping research, companies don't tend to do that if they're stopping the research altogether. So the fact that we managed to do that, and that came from the weight of voice from the community. We set up the program, normally a expanded access program, or a compassionate use as it's sometimes called, can take months and months. We did it in 3 months to make sure that those children didn't miss a dose. And that motivation to do good work, it comes directly from that community interaction, and that drove my colleagues, who were actually losing their jobs as the company was being restructured, to work as fast and as hard as possible to set that up, because they knew what the outcome was, and the outcome was people on medicines that we know work for them. So that was a really impactful, more recent example of really the community driving what we do.
And the passion that you brought to advocating for the compassionate use program, I remember having conversations with you back then, and that passion, ultimately, your commitment made a difference. So that's a great example of how being an advocate for the patient community can be so important. And Procure is a great example. The Procure Laboratoire Thea story is such a great example of how challenging clinical trials and therapy development can be, because you had a therapy that was working, it didn't meet an endpoint in a clinical trial, the company moves out of the ophthalmology space, and almost miraculously, another company picks up the assets and moves them forward. What do you think, having been through that experience, what is so important for the patient community to understand about trials and therapy development?
Yeah, so I kind of thinking about this. Yeah, I wish it was more linear. I wish it was easier in terms of drugs development, but it takes time. But it also takes a lot of action to actually carry on the programs. And I think, from my perspective, having been through that from the Pro QR days transitioning to Thea, the community anecdotal kind of testimonies, the videos that we did played a huge part. Like we've shown them multiple times internally now. I'll show them again at a launch team meeting we have in the coming weeks and months, because I think it's extremely important to show what the medicines can do. Because ultimately, you could look at the result of Illuminate, and it was flat against sham, which took us all by surprise. But when you go into it, due to the variability of the trial itself, we weren't giving the drug its best shot. The trial design really let down the medicine. And I think when it comes to kind of outlining how the many twists and turns there are in medicine development in general, for the community itself, a lot of it is to do with safety. It's to making sure that the medicines and molecules that we're creating in research are fit for humans. That's the first point that is really, really needs to be made. And then when it comes to kind of particularly rarer conditions as well, there is sometimes a lack of understanding at the regulatory level, even within companies that are bringing these molecules forward, and the general public. So I think that always adds to time. And I think that's the really underlying issue that we certainly have at the moment in the world, where everything is more immediate. I think we can all recognize that everything in our lives is getting quicker, but there are some things like medicine development that still take a decade from molecule founding to getting in the clinic. And that just comes down to education and helping people have a very good idea of the multiple layers that we have to go through, from kind of the safety elements, the multiple assessments that we have to do preclinically, and then into humans. And it's always a handful of people in that phase one, because we just don't know how a molecule will react in humans. And that seems very strange in a world where we have more black and white answers to certain more nuanced debate. That's how I would describe it.
Right. I think that time element is so important for people to understand. And when somebody has a retinal condition that's slowly, or maybe not so slowly, progressing and taking their vision, they have such an urgency, and that just creates even more anxiety and frustration when science moves slowly. I guess the good news is science moves a lot more quickly than it used to, but it's still not fast enough. So I'm glad you made that point. Kara, Atsena's had a different journey than the Procure Sepul Bio journey. It's almost miraculous that your first two gene therapies have performed so well in clinical trials and are moving forward. But getting back to my question that I had for Andy, what do you think is important for patients and families to understand that maybe they don't appreciate so frequently?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the time that goes into therapy development is not well understood. And I don't think anybody would or should understand it unless you are constantly looking behind the curtain the way that Andy and I often are. But even when things go perfectly smoothly, you know, as you mentioned, Atsena's been very fortunate that we haven't had those setbacks in our programs at this point that are often faced by other companies. And yet it's still a very long road. So our founder, Shannon, she began working on her work in LCA with her PhD a long time ago before founding the company. So the starting journey of the therapy that is in clinical trials now for LCA began a long time ago and went through so much testing with blind chickens and all sorts of preclinical or animal testing that had to be done before it could ever get to a point of even being considered for human clinical trials. And even then, once you get to that point, the amount of paperwork and contracts and just underlying administrative pieces is extremely complex and takes a long time. And then, not to mention, just making the therapy. It's not quite as simple as running into your kitchen and throwing a few things in a blender, and you've now got a therapy. Developing or making, manufacturing the therapy itself is a very, very time intensive process that even when it all goes perfectly smoothly, still often takes longer than any patient or family would want or be satisfied by, because, like you said, oftentimes they're progressing or losing ability on a day to day basis. And so, even when we're working as fast as we can, it's still not fast enough. But I think that towards the beginning of our conversation, what we were talking about with getting the input of patients to make research better, that makes it faster. If you can design a trial better based off of feedback that you've received from patients and their families, and your trial design is set up to be as best as it can be, you've got a better chance of the trial being successful rather than, the trial failing, but not the drug failing. And so I think, it all comes into play together, but I think that piece of time that goes into all of the back end work behind the curtain is something that I wish we could explain better and do better, but it is just very time intensive.
Right. And I think you touched on something that's so important, the patient perspective and the patient input into the clinical trial process. Can you think of an example where a patient had some information or perspective that really helped in designing a trial or adding a particular element to a study?
Yeah. So in one of our programs, we had heard that one of the things that was affected most in the patient's daily life was their ability to read. Probably not very surprising to many people who are listening to this podcast, but the ability to read is clearly affected when your vision is impacted. But we weren't measuring that in our clinical trial. And so after we heard that from people and heard that that was one of the biggest impacts of their daily life, we found that there is a clinical assessment that you can use that's validated and it's done in the clinic and it's, scientifically rigorous, but it measures how quickly or efficiently someone can read and if that changes over time. And so we've now implemented that into the trial to say, okay, this is something we heard from people is a real life day to day impact of their disease. Let's measure it in the clinical trial. And then towards the end of it, if that improves, that's going to be incredibly meaningful to say this is something that people pay attention to in their daily life. It's been measured and has changed in the trial. If that's the case, and is going to be more meaningful than, some number from a test that nobody quite understands the purpose of.
Certainly, certainly. Reading is so fundamental to daily life. You would think it would be an obvious thing to include, but it's great that you use patient feedback to incorporate that reading test.
Mhm. On the flip side, we've done the opposite. We've heard from some patients who said, "Oh, this one test is so terrible. We hate it. It's unbearable. It's so invasive." And we realized that we weren't actually getting very useful information out of it anyway, so we've taken it out of our clinical trial because why do something that is bothersome and not well tolerated by patients if it's not going to be helpful anyways.
Certainly. Good point. Andy, is there something about the patient perspective that you feel has informed Sepul Bio trial design or therapy development?
A really fantastic example that we had. So I interviewed, they reached out proactively, a former clinical participant in one of our programs, and he wanted to just help inform how his experience had went. And because he wasn't in the trial anymore, we had an open discussion. And he was very honest, actually. So there's a test called dark adaptive promotory, where basically someone sits in a dark room and lights different are fired at them, and they have to click a button. And he was super open and honest that he fell asleep in all but one of his times that he had to do that test. And he told me that very, very openly. And as an advocate, I absolutely love that feedback, because I'm not a clinical scientist, but I can imagine you're not going to get great data if someone is asleep during one of your assessments. So I asked if he would be willing to be videoed and give that testimony, and then I could use it internally for our protocol design. And it actually changed how we do our assessments and what part of the day we do them. So the most difficult, as it is a really important one, to really register the different light that gets in and different colors, is the first thing that you do in the morning. We really reordered how we do our protocol and the assessments to make sure that someone doesn't have a big lunch and then falls asleep during in a dark room, which on reflection as a human being, I would do that all the time. I think if someone gave me a big lunch and then I had to go and sit in a dark room, and it even brought up kind of wider discussion about, well, if someone is listening to a podcast, will that have any effect on their eyesight or their concentration, or if they want to listen to music? Obviously, they have to be able to listen to the coordinator's instructions or what's happening when. But those were really pushing the boundaries of, actually, we'd never thought about how to make someone more comfortable in that situation and just leave them in a silent, dark room with the buzzing of the machine as it goes on through the assessment. So that was quite a big fundamental change, and really was quite a humanization kind of grounding process to the kind of clinical assessments and the order of which we do them in. And then a final example would be the clinical trial design that we're doing for our phase 3 Hyperion trial is a paired eye design. So that's an injection in one eye and then a placebo injection in the other. And we did lots of discussion with the community, individuals and physicians about those multiple injections, because they are really important. Having a paired eye design, it's never been done at a phase 3 level before. You normally have a randomized sham arm in your study, which is more traditional. So to really have that feedback gave us, a really positive and motivating way of going to the regulators and say, this is how we think we can give this molecule its best shot in what would be its final attempt.
Right. And with that placebo injection, is that an actual injection into the vitreous? It's just like saline or something?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And that was a requirement from the FDA to really mask the difference between which ones are the injected eye. A lot of physicians actually had hesitancy there, right? It's for good reason, which is why having that wider discussion with every single person in the process was really important for landing on that design and the reasons for it.
Right. But if it gives you a better opportunity to get approval and it is relatively safe, then it obviously makes sense.
Absolutely.
And I want to take a moment to talk about Hope and Focus's role in helping you, Andy and Kara, collect that information, because obviously Hope and Focus is connected to the LCA community. So this is an important thing that Hope and Focus does, is connect the community with therapy developers like you. So a shout out to Hope and Focus for that work. And before we conclude here, I want to give another shout out to Hope and Focus. On November 1st, which is coming up in a few weeks, they are hosting their biggest fundraising event of the year called Dinner in the Dark. It's at Foxwoods Resort Casino in Mashantucket, Connecticut. And it's a great evening. I've been to many dinners in the dark. they're fun, and you get to eat a gourmet dinner while you're blindfolded, which, depending on who you are, may or may not be fun. But there will definitely be some laughter, music, dancing, and most importantly, if you join, you can help fund the great work of Hope and Focus. And to find out more information about that dinner and to get your tickets, go to hopeandfocus.org/dinner. Again, that's hopeandfocus.org/dinner. And back to Andy and Kara, I just want to thank you both for sharing so much great information about your roles as patient advocates, how important the patient voice is in therapy development and clinical trial design. It's been a really wonderful discussion, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. So thank you for taking time out of your busy day to talk with me on the podcast about, again, the great work that you do.
Well, it's been a pleasure to join you, and I hope that anybody who's listened to this walks away just feeling that they're empowered and that their voice really does matter. We talked about a lot of technical things today, but really the patient voice is so, so critical and important for developing therapies. And thank you for giving us the platform to talk about it with you, Ben.
Ben, I think, from my side, it's been a huge pleasure to join this. And, if there are any families out there that want to get in touch through Hope and Focus. To reiterate Kara's point, your advocacy is so important to the work that we do. It helps us as patient advocates in companies to showcase just how empowered families and individuals are. And that lived experience is incredibly important. It's I can't reiterate that enough. Just having your view and how it's like and how a medicine could it help in your life could make a huge difference to us. It gives us motivation, and it really helps just drive the message of continuing to do clinical research.
Well said. Well said. Andy and Kara, thanks again for joining the podcast. And listeners, thanks again for tuning into the Hope and Focus podcast. It's an honor and a privilege to host these episodes, and we look forward to having you back to the next one. Take care.
Whether you live with vision loss or love someone who does, this space is for you. To learn more about Hope and Focus and join us in advancing treatments for LCA, visit hopeandfocus.org and connect with us on social media @HopeandFocus1. Together, we are bringing hope into focus.